If your reaction is anything like mine after viewing the question for the first time, then you're probably turning inside with a number of different emotions. Perhaps you're feeling a sense of urgency for someone you know who is hurting, or perhaps a sense of grief or guilt for someone you've lost to suicide. Or perhaps you're experiencing fear or despair because, like most of us, you don't have all the answers. Well, conflict is not bad when it leads to resolution. In the next 20 minutes, we're going to deal with the conflict we feel concerning suicide, and we're going to move towards resolution. Remember, our phone lines are open if you need help. Let's begin by getting some feedback on the film from our audience. Yes.
I think there's a lot of people who are wondering the same question. They're going through their life and there really isn't any meaning. They're living for maybe their family, their friends, and material wealth, but what are they going to do when that all goes away?
Yes.
I can remember sitting for the last 10 minutes of the film and on the edge of my chair and with my teeth clenched, and I don't know why, but just tensed. That was my main feeling through the whole thing.
Yes.
I think the film was very interesting and emotional. What I thought was interesting with it is that it didn't give us the answer. It still presented the question that many of us may not have thought of before tonight.
Okay.
Right now my heart's just pounding because I remember an incident that happened to me in high school. One of my best friends kept talking about how he was going to commit suicide. And one weekend he took off, and I didn't know where he was at. It was one of the worst weekends of my whole life, one of the worst days, 2 days. He comes back to school Monday morning, and I was so relieved. I just about gave him a hug and kissed him right there in the middle of the hallway. I was so glad to see him. And I asked him, I said, what happened? He goes, the rope broke. He was so disappointed that the rope broke. I could just hear that anguish in his voice, that he thought that was going to be the answer to his problems that he was going through because of his family life and because of school.
Yes. Very, very real problem, isn't it? How did some of the rest of you feel as you reacted to it, as you saw the film? What are your feelings? What happened inside? Yes.
It actually happens. My friend committed suicide January 15th of this year, and I went through the same thing. It's just that hard on you.
What kind of things did you go through?
Just denial and just, oh, no, is he going to come back? You know, you think it's a joke right away. It's not.
So it was really a very real experience to you.
Yeah, it is. Just like that kid went through.
Yeah. And when it comes to you, it's so much harder, isn't it? It's hard when you're right involved. The film talks about suicide because of a lack of purpose in life. I'm curious, we have several folks with us on our panel. Gentlemen, how realistic do you see this kind of suicide? Was this real? Was it accurate? Does it portray what is actually going on in our world?
Look at it this way. This guy was a young man. As probably everybody knows this day and age because it's getting a lot of publicity. That's a high-risk group. There's been a real increase in that sort of age range. He used a gun, it's a lethal weapon. He was using alcohol before the suicide, which is a common signal and also maybe part of what potentiates or allows somebody to kill himself. There are some indications that he may have been depressed. He'd certainly become very cynical and negativistic about things. And he'd lost a girlfriend and flunked out of school. So he was really getting hammered with a lot of the things that are frequently found if you go back and do an autopsy or exploration of somebody's suicide.
They tell us that all of us will face the suicide situation in some way. In fact, 1 out of every 3 people will face the suicide issue in that we will have a friend, a close friend, or a family member who will commit suicide in our lifetime. How many of you have had a close friend or have had a family member commit suicide? maybe we just see a show of hands. How many of you have been close to a suicide situation? Okay, so suicide is a very real problem. The question is, how do we recognize a potential suicide situation? Maybe someone from the panel here could help us, if our special guest could give us some help in finding out how to recognize a suicide situation.
There's comments that people make, our youth, and it could be statements that, you know, the world is a bummer, I've had it, and go even more explicit that I'm going to end it all. And these need to be taken seriously. So those are cues that really need to be, a person needs to be alert to.
What would be some of the things that would relate to depression? How would we recognize that?
Depression, there is a clinical kind of state of depression, depressive illness that I frequently see as a psychiatrist that has a high incidence of suicidal thinking and suicide attempts, and perhaps a third to two-thirds of all suicides are committed by people who are in a state of depression. Now, I think many more may be depressed or demoralized or discouraged or hopeless, but not necessarily have a depressive illness. I think, though, the recognition, we were talking about verbal cues, there are some things that you can pick up without anyone saying a thing, and some of them are symptoms of depression. Changes in sleep, either up or down, appetite changes, people who start withdrawing socially or activities drop off that they used to enjoy, people who are failing at school, performance going down, getting in trouble with the law, starting to use drugs and alcohol like this guy did, or starting to abuse them.
Or play chicken with the train?
This risky, very suggestive behavior.
The next question is, what do we do about this? How do we help somebody? We've seen these signs. Where do we go from here?
Yeah, I think that differentiating an urgent situation from sub-urgent is important. And there are some classic problems that at least I see from time to time. And sometimes we're so contemplative and thoughtful that we don't take action. And I think calling the police, may be sometimes necessary. If you are staying with the person, if I walk down the basement and see my brother fondling a shotgun, I'm not going to leave him to go up and call a crisis center. He's going to come up with me. You know, so there's if there's an urgent moment, don't leave the person, and either take them with you to a crisis center, emergency room, or call someone in their presence.
I think one of our friends back here mentioned about the rope broke. Where do we go from there?
On a practical way, I'd emphasize to youth particularly that do not get caught in that tight friendship and you promise secrecy that you're not going to tell anybody about it, because that often a suicidal attempt to do that. And that's not helping that individual. You might totally lose a friend.
Let me interrupt you just a minute here, Marv. I want to ask you a question. Is it true that usually volunteers or friends tend to be the people more than anybody else that a teenager would tell about a suicide?
That's my experience. Usually the close friend and maybe a relative, significant person like that, would be the one that really hear of it first. My clinic tends to hear about it last.
Yes, we have a question here.
I'd like to ask, what if you have a friend and it's like they're to the point where they don't care and they don't want others around them, and they got to the point where they don't care about life in general or anyone else or themselves or what happens?
When I'm in that situation, it's usually with somebody who's seriously suicidal and seriously ill, and there comes a point where you've got to violate their wishes in the favor of protecting them. I'm not sure if that's the situation you're thinking about. The law of the land is that, that you can overstep a person's liberty if they're at a point where they're of imminent danger to themselves. So, that may not be the most common situation, somebody who's just gloomy and lonely and wants to get away. But if it's somebody who just bought a rope and then they want to go, at that point, say, look, I'm sorry, but I can't let you do that.
And I think that's a loving thing to do.
Yeah.
And sometimes we think, this is a terrible thing to do, but it's really, it really is love.
It's very hard. It's very hard for me to do that, even though I've done it many times. It's still hard because it shatters your rapport at the moment. The person is very angry with you sometimes for thwarting their intent.
It's kind of interesting that in the experience of the film, when Will got the letter from his brother Paul, something happened that kind of struck me, and I think it fits to all of us. Let me ask you to identify for a moment. If you were in the situation of Will, that's the younger brother, what would you have said to Paul had he walked in and said, I'm going to end it all. It isn't worth it. What would you say to Paul? Let's hear from some of you.
This might sound a little cruel, but I'd say fine, but what about the 300 people that'll end up going to your funeral?
What do you mean about the 300 people that would go to the funeral?
What about, you shattered every one of their dreams. They're all you do have friends, even though you don't know about them. They're people willing to help. They're not there at the moment because you haven't looked for them.
Paul comes into your room and says, I think I'm going to end it all. What would you say to him to help him? How would you intervene? Yes. And your thoughts about it?
I think I just tell him that if we show our love for each other, and just if he can tell me his problems, and I can maybe share some of my problems with him, and together maybe we can find out that's not so bad.
Okay. Fred, you wrote this film. If Paul were to walk into your office and said, I'm ready to end the whole thing, what would you tell him?
And in writing the film, I imagine Paul to be a person who was dealing with the question that I've seen a lot of young people deal with. In fact, in 7 years of working with young people, I believe that Paul's question is very common, and that a lot of the problems that young people are dealing with today really relate to a deeper issue, that a lot of the problems they're dealing with are really symptoms of a deeper problem, and that has to do with who am I, why am I here, what's it all about, and that's exactly what Paul was asking. And the way I would respond to that is basically I would tell him that personally I believe that there is a God, and that this God is real, that He's personal, and that He has the answers to these questions, and that we can know Him, and that we can know Him because He's revealed Himself through the Bible and through Jesus Christ. And that is what I would tell Paul. I would tell him that there are answers to his questions, because that's really why he's killing himself, is because he doesn't have answers.
Are you saying then, do I understand you correctly, that the kind of the bottom line or the root of the problem of suicide is a spiritual one?
Yes, I believe that that's true.
Fred, if that is really what you believe, why in the world, when you made this film, didn't you just come right out and say it? Why are you kind of backdooring it?
The steps that a person goes through in making the kind of decision and trusting God with their problems, that in order to make that step, that they have to go through the process that we're starting with the question. I recognize, in having worked with young people, that it's easy to manipulate people into decisions, and I feel that starting from the place of asking the questions and understanding why am I here is really the place to start, so that when that young person or that adult comes to the conclusion and says, there really is a God, and I do believe He has the answers, and I'm going to look to Him to find those answers, that conclusion is His conclusion, and it's not something that I've manipulated. And so, the Bible says that those who seek will find, and I believe if a person is really seeking the truth, that he's going to find that God will move heaven and hell to bring the answers.
So, what you've been saying, if I understand correctly, is more in the area, you assume that it's a spiritual thing. I'm interested, I'd like to hear from you gentlemen, and you come from a different perspective. What do you see about bottom line of suicide, and do you think, where does the spiritual side fit in relationship to physical and emotional and all these other areas?
Spiritual is bottom line, but that's not to ignore the total person, and I approach a person emotionally, mentally, socially, and spiritually, and very much spiritually as well, not ignoring that, but looking at the whole person and why are they on earth. So we get back to the basic Christianity, created and sustained by God. In counseling, I like to see counselors looking at the whole person.
It's not, I don't think it's a single issue problem. A common phrase is that a dozen people can kill themselves and be committing a dozen different psychological acts, and one suicide can represent a dozen different contributions. And I think it's a biological, social, cultural, psychological, interpersonal, existential malaise that we're dealing with. I think the existential and the spiritual dimension is it's in there with the rest of them. And some people, it's very critical, like this fella. Somebody who has got a psychotic disorder and thinks they better jump before the devil gets them and destroys them, I don't think in that case that it's a spiritual issue. So I think remembering it's not a simplistic single issue is important.
Okay, so it's a multiple thing. Now I want to get back to something you said, Fred. You said that you think the spiritual side is the bottom line.
Right.
Now it seems to me like I've come across some people who have that quote-unquote spiritual relationship, who are Christians, and they've committed suicide. How do you explain that?
When I use the word Christian, I'm not just talking about a set of values, you know, that sort of a religious code by which I live. I'm talking about a personal relationship. And I believe that there are a lot of people who have very possibly entered into a relationship with God, maybe even a personal relationship, but it's not personal to the point that they have trusted God with their problems, that they're actually getting to know Him, and that they're actually walking with Him, and that they're actually trusting Him to do the things that they can't do. And so when I use the word Christian, I'm not, first of all, I'm not trying to say that Christians don't hurt, because Christians are people just like everybody else's people. They're just alive in the spiritual area in a different way. Secondly, I'm not trying to use that word Christian to talk about people who have a certain philosophical mindset, or I'm talking about people who really have a relationship and appropriate what God has for them.
Yes, I'd like to ask Mr. Carpenter, what if one loses faith in God, like I had to suffer through divorce, parents, and abuse, and going through drugs and everything, and what if I stopped believing in God because it didn't seem to help me anymore? How would one try to revert from suicide if he's lost faith in God?
Well, I think that every person who is considering suicide is really at the same place that you're describing. I mean, you are describing to me a hopeless situation. You're saying you don't have hope. But see, that's really where every person who commits suicide is at, really. And so I would really say the same thing to you that we've been saying to all these people. First of all, you may really need some help. You may need me to lend you a helping hand because you can't help yourself. Maybe I need to get you someplace where you're going to have 24-hour care. As it relates to your relationship with God, what I would say is one important thing that I've really been able to draw strength on is that God isn't going to let go of me. You may let go of Him, but when you enter into that relationship, He's able to keep you. The Bible is very clear that Jesus is a shepherd, and that He doesn't lose His sheep. I can guarantee you, if my little girl had fallen off a cliff, and the only thing she could hold on to was this twig, and I reached down and I grabbed her to pull her up, and she was hanging and would drop hundreds of feet, and I reached down to pull her up, that even if she let go, and couldn't hold on, that I would not let go of her. You see, I just wouldn't do that as a father. And that's the way God is. When we reach out to Him, He's not going to let go. So you may lose your faith, and you may need support from people. You know, I'm not just saying that it's just between you and God and that's all there is to it. You may need support from people, and it may be a process that you go through. The thing I would say to you is don't give up. You know, keep at it. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay.
I'd like to wrap this up by taking one more look at Paul's letter. Paul said, I'll be the first to admit that I've really screwed up my life, but that's not the real problem. The real problem is there's no reason to fix it. There is a reason to fix it, and there is a way. As we've recognized here, suicide is a very complex problem with a multiplicity of factors. But the root of the problem is spiritual in nature. Now, I know that many of you watching the program are ready to give God an opportunity to help fix the broken places in your life. I also know that many of you may not be ready to trust God with your problems, but you know that you are hurting, and you know that you need help. Please don't let this opportunity pass you by. We want to meet you right where you are, wherever you are. Please call. Call if you need help or if someone you know needs help. Thank you for joining us, and God bless you.
Selected by the Christian Film and Video Association as the best youth film and the best evangelistic film of the year, Without Reservation is an emotional and intellectual knockout, according to Jim Hancock of the Youth Worker Journal. Without Reservation is the story of 6 teenagers who leave the party, unaware that 4 of them are about to enter a new dimension, never to return. Victims of a fatal automobile accident, they find themselves suspended in time and space, somewhere between heaven and hell.
What do I do, man? Mary! 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 Mary!
Through a window in space, they're able to observe those they've left behind and to preview their individual destinies. Stripped of all pretense, they each have a different and revealing response as they learn the consequences of facing eternity without reservation.
I want to go back. Why can't we all just go back?
This sobering story concludes with an unexpected turn that powerfully communicates the hope that we have in Christ.
There's something I need to talk to you about. It's about Jesus. Jesus Christ.
Wait. That reservation has just been confirmed.
Without Reservation will move Christians to share their faith with a renewed sense of purpose and will challenge others to seriously examine their personal relationship with Jesus Christ. If you think you have plenty of time, this film will make you think again. How would you feel to wake up one day and discover that you'd never been born? 1 in a Million is the story of Bobby, a teenager struggling to find self-worth. Thrust into an emergency situation, Bobby risks his life to save an infant. Suddenly, he's a hero. A sense of destiny rises within him.
Wow, this looks great.
But as he soon discovers, even heroes have to do chores around the house. Later that week, while cleaning out the attic for his mom, he discovers her diary. He reads of her romance with his father, her struggle over a premarital pregnancy, and finally, her decision to abort the baby. As Bobby examines the abortion date, he realizes that he was the victim of that abortion and that he had never actually been born.
That's me.
Suddenly, history is rewritten. What could have been will never be. Charged with emotional intensity, 1 in a Million creates a powerful premise for discussing the sanctity of human life.
Then I am certain to be successful in this journey. Thank you. Thank you, ladies.
Winner of 5 International Film Awards, The Question is the story of senior class president Will Turner. Only days before delivering an address at his high school graduation, Will's excitement is interrupted by the tragic news of his brother's suicide.
Sure that it was Paul?
I didn't see much meaning.
Driven by anger and grief, Will is determined to discover why his brother decided to end his life. Reliving memories of his brother, he tries to sort things out.
I'm sorry about your...
Searching for answers, he is surrounded by adults who are unable to deal honestly with the situation.
I had one of those viruses that was going around. And then
I understand you're going to be giving the senior address at the commencement exercise.
The day before his graduation, Will receives Paul's suicide letter. Will is overcome with the realization that not only is he without answers, but he has never even faced the question that drove Paul to suicide.
My brother was not crazy. He may have been very confused, but he was not crazy. He has asked a very important question. What is the purpose of life? A question that some of us are afraid to ask. Maybe because we're afraid we'll never find the answer.
Mike Iaconelli of Youth Specialties says of the question, finally, someone has figured out how to make a truly Christian film. How do you know that what you believe is true? Angel of Light is the story of a young woman's search for spiritual identity. Through her psychology class, Sarah is drawn into a New Age belief system. The path that she has chosen leads to a parting of ways with a special friend named John. At a weekend retreat, Sarah learns a type of meditation through which she encounters a spirit guide who calls himself Avedon. At first, Avedon comes to her as an angel of light. But what begins as a gratifying experience soon plunges Sarah into a walking nightmare as Avedon transforms into a very powerful and evil being. Confused and afraid, Sarah seeks an explanation from Gloria, her psychology professor. As Gloria speaks, Sarah recalls the words of John.
How do you know that you're not being deceived? How do you know that for sure?
Winner of the Matrix Award, Angel of Light is a gnawing, soul-searching trip that forces us to examine why we believe what we believe. Angel of Light is an excellent tool to prepare high school students for the type of belief systems they will encounter on the university campus. Rich Van Pelt of Youth Specialties says that Angel of Light is unquestionably one of the most powerful educational media pieces he has ever used in 18 years of ministry to young people and their families. In the words of author and lecturer Tony Campolo, the material was brilliantly conceived.
God was reaching for me.